Well, those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells have a specialized photopigment, which is maximally sensitive in the blue part of the spectrum. And it's for those of you who want to know the details, it's 480 nanometers. And what that translates to is the blue of a very beautiful blue sky. And this led to lots of ideas that blue light is going to be potentially useful, yes, but also potentially disruptive. So an argument arose that, okay, well, we know that dusk light delays the clock, means you get up later the next day. So blue light could be really bad for you in delaying the clock if you get blue light in the evening. So this was based upon theory. And on the basis of that theory, people said, oh, you shouldn't look at a computer screen, which is blue enriched in the evening. And so apps have been developed which shift from a blue enriched screen to a more red enriched screen, taking it away from the blue light. And there's also apps that you can use on your smartphone for this. There is absolutely no data that shows that this has any effect at all, which is really quite striking. And there's a very interesting study also about light in the evening from electronic devices. Some of your listeners may remember some headlines that if you look at a Kindle before you go to bed, then you're going to massively disrupt your sleep-wake cycle. Well, it's worth digging into the data. So what individuals were asked to do was to look at a Kindle on its brightest light setting for 4 hours immediately before bedtime, before you're going to sleep, on 5 consecutive nights. And at the end of 5 nights in this group of individuals, sleep was delayed by 9 minutes, just statistically significantly. And in fact, I remember one of my colleagues at the time said, well, that may be statistically significant, but that's biologically meaningless. Now, that light did have an effect upon the hormone melatonin. It did shift the rhythm in melatonin, and it did suppress the melatonin. But it raises a really important point too, that melatonin is often called the sleep hormone. Well, it isn't. It's a mild modulator of sleep. And these studies showed that brilliantly. Sleep-wake timing was delayed by about 9 minutes, and it didn't correlate with the marked changes that were seen in melatonin. Okay, so that's where a lot of this started. However, a Scandinavian group then sort of repeated these experiments, but rather than keeping the subjects under dim light during the day, 90 lux during the day, prior to the 30 lux Kindle exposure in the evening, they gave them 500 to 600 lux for several hours during the middle of the day. And that completely abolished any effects on behavior and any effects of melatonin. So if you're getting even moderate levels of light during the day, you're not going to be bothered by dim light in the evening. It seems that if you're exposed to dim light during the day, it sensitizes the system and makes it a bit more sensitive to light in the evening. Most of us, of course, are getting light during the day, and the Kindle conclusion is largely as an artifact of the experimental methodology. And this is what we're finding all the time. The claims that are made ultimately are not being substantiated. So the bottom line here is that, yes, if the light is bright enough for long enough, you will delay the clock in the evening. But for most applications, looking at a computer screen, reading your Kindle, sitting in a sitting room, you're going to have almost no effect upon the clock at all. And if you've been out during the day and it's been exposed to moderate levels of light, it's going to desensitize the clock to evening light. So those issues have sort of emerged. But the whole business about blue light, it's got to be blue light. Well, that's based upon the fact that these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are blue light sensitive. But what we now know is that the rods and the cones, those visual cells, can interact with those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So we have a short wavelength cone peaking at 420 nanometers, so in the sort of violet range. We have 2 green cones, which are sort of peaking at 530 and 560 nanometers, and the rods. peaking at 500. So there's a potentially very broad spectral input into those photosensitive ganglion cells. How they interact is unclear, but we do know that they do, and it may well be that they're not simply additive. So, for example, that short wavelength cone could actually be inhibitory. So just saying it's blue light, is a gross oversimplification. There's other receptors, the visual cells, modulating the responses of those photosensitive ganglion cells. The tragedy is we don't have enough information. We know that you need bright light of a long duration, but we don't precisely know how much. We know that light during the day can modify your responses to light in the evening. We know that there's huge individual variation between people and their sensitivity to light. We know that age changes our responses to light. We've touched on the fact of whether you're inside or outside, your light history. So there's lots of things all interacting. And what we don't have at the moment is a sufficient, in my view, evidence base to make recommendations for our exposure to light. So you'll see statements like you shouldn't see more than 30 lux 2 hours before you go to bed. Well, I think that's really misleading and potentially dangerous in the sense that if you're an elderly individual moving around your environment, you want bright light to see. We also know that elderly people are less sensitive to light in terms of their circadian system. So these sort of bland statements, I think, are misleading. And we need a better evidence base to have specific recommendations, and we don't have it yet.